All right, good morning. Welcome to my presentation today about behavioral economics, one of my favorite subjects. In this presentation, I'll first give you an overview of behavioral economics, and then I'll take you through a series of studies and experiments around two of the most important concepts in behavioral economics research, namely loss aversion and present bias. Finally, I'll discuss the real-life application of these theories and insights from behavioral economics. So, first of all, what is behavioral economics? Simply put, behavioral economics is the intersection between economics and psychology. If you look at the bubble on the left, economics, for many years, economics assumed that all economic participants were rational beings. Following this premise, you would say that a rational person will always make decisions that lead to optimization. In other words, economics starts with the assumption that everyone behaves in a way that creates the greatest benefit or profit for themselves. But behavioral economics, on the other hand, combines economics with psychology. It's all about how people's decision-making departs from this rationality assumption. Here I use the word depart from rationality without necessarily meaning that people's behaviors are in any way wrong or misguided. Because in a sense, if you behave in a certain way, that behavior kind of justifies itself. When you think about it, economics as an academic subject has been around for a little over 2 centuries. Yet human behavior has a much longer history than that, which can be measured in millions of years. In fact, some of the behavioral tendencies that we'll discuss today can actually be attributed to evolutionary explanations. I will come back to this point later. So in a nutshell, if there's one word that defines behavioral economics, it is irrationality. Well, let's start with the history of behavioral economics. In the early days of economics, you all know Adam Smith and his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued that individuals are all self-interested, every man for himself, really. And as a result, the system of economy, or the system of a capitalistic economy, to be precise, is a series of cost-benefit analysis. The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, which can be roughly seen as the beginning of economics as a real modern academic subject. But few people know that even prior to writing The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith wrote another book in 1759 titled The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In this book, Adam Smith, the same author, actually analyzed the role of irrational behaviors in the decision-making process. And interestingly, many of the ideas of contemporary behavioral economics were already discussed by Adam Smith 250 years ago in this book. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the idea of irrational decisions has been a part of economics since its inception. Then, if we fast forward to the 20th century, what we call Neoclassical Economics took the center stage, and neoclassical economists would argue that it's the equilibrium between supply and demand, which is based on individuals' rationality and their ability to maximize utility or profit, that defines economics. The good thing about this development is that it allowed for people's behaviors and the outcomes of behaviors, therefore, to be mathematically calculated. And this later became the predominant framework of economics for many years. And it led to, in all fairness, it led to a very fruitful age for economics. If you have taken any introduction level economics course in college, like myself, you might still remember concepts like the utility function, the equilibrium, elasticity, marginal cost. etc. This approach was developed in the 19th century, and it became popular in the 20th century. Then fast forward to the 21st century. After the 2008 financial crisis, more and more people raised this question of why is it that mainstream economists all failed to predict the first financial crisis of this century? Are there some elements of irrationality in our behavior after all? A professor of behavioral finance by the name of Robert J. Shiller was among the small handful of scholars who correctly predicted the financial crisis. From then on, more and more people began to accept behavioral economics as a way to go about understanding people's economic behaviors. Professor Robert Shiller was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2013. And later in 2017, Professor Richard Thaler from the University of Chicago was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics again for his contribution to behavioral economics. These distinctions brought the subject of behavioral economics into the spotlight, and as of today, a total of 6 Nobel Prizes for economics have been awarded for behavioral research. That's a brief review of history, and now, next I'll walk you through 2 of the most important insights into how people's behaviors are irrational, as we call it. The first one is known as loss aversion. Loss aversion refers to the fact that we hate losses. And oftentimes we hate losses more than we should hate losses. What do I mean by that? Because it seems that 1 unit of loss makes us unhappy to a greater extent than 1 unit of gain would make you happy. One of the most famous field experiments that proved loss aversion was conducted in an electronics factory in China. And here's how the experiment was carried out. The manager at this factory told the workers that they have a certain productivity target for the next 4 weeks. Everyone was offered a bonus for achieving the target. Then these workers were unaware that they were actually taking part in a research study. They think they are just simply working towards a target on the assembly line. But how it works is that about half of the workers were told that for each week in the next 4 weeks in which they meet the weekly production target, they would earn a bonus of 80 RMB, 80 Chinese yuan, which is roughly 15 US dollars. The other half of the workers were told that they were already approved for a bonus of 320 RMB for all 4 weeks. However, in the next 4 weeks, every time their performance failed to meet that weekly target, 80 RMB would be deducted from their bonus. All right, are we on the same page? If you think about it, the economic incentives offered to the 2 groups are identical. Because if you are a worker, you meet the target in all 4 weeks, you get 320 RMB. If you don't meet it in any of the 4 weeks, you get nothing. If you meet 1, 2, or 3 weeks, you get somewhere between 80 RMB and 240 RMB. So that's the deal. But the incentives were described to the workers differently. For the first group as a bonus contract, and for the second group as a penalty contract. You either get a bonus you think you get a bonus for meeting the target, or in the second group, you get a penalty for not meeting the target. Question. Which group do you think did better by the end of the 4 weeks? The bonus contract or the penalty contract? The result was that the average productivity of workers in the penalty condition was about 1% higher than their counterparts in the reward condition or the bonus condition. I know 1% higher sounds like a small difference, but don't forget that economically speaking, the company offered exactly the same bonus to the 2 groups, but achieved this 1 extra % boost in their productivity by framing it differently. In management, if you think of this as a management technique, it's sometimes described as carrots that look like sticks. You use sticks, or you present the incentive as a stick because people react to penalty more strongly, precisely because of what we call loss aversion. Now let's conceptualize this idea of loss aversion with this chart. The horizontal axis is outcome. In other words, how much did you get from something? Positive outcomes are called gains, negative outcomes are called losses. The vertical axis is value, which is the same thing as utility in economics terminology. You can think of it as a measure of how happy did the outcome make you. And then you look at this curve. Even though we didn't put numbers on the graph, just the shape of this curve really touches on a number of very important discoveries. For one, the curve goes up. Your perceived value increases as opposed to decreases with the outcome, and that's obvious. Second, the utility curve is not a straight line. It gradually flattens out on the far left and on the far right. This speaks to what we call diminishing marginal utility, and that's also in line with conventional thinking in economics. Nothing new. The third characteristic of this curve is what I'm really getting at. When you look closely at the central part of the curve, where it hits the point of origin, you'll notice that the positive portion on the right and the negative portion on the left don't seem to have the same slope. It goes down on the left more drastically than it goes up on the right. This is to say that 1 unit of loss has a bigger effect than 1 unit of gain. And that is the main point of loss aversion. People's perception of gains and losses are not symmetrical. In the previous example, for example, with the two groups of workers, for the first group of workers, their reference point is set at 0 bonus. So if they somehow hit the target in a certain week, they have a gain of 80 RMB. But for the second group, their reference point is preset to be 320 RMB because they were told, okay, you already have this bonus, 320 RMB approved. But then if you fail to meet the target in a given week, you lose 80 RMB. You have a negative outcome of negative 80. And I told you that workers in the second group, the penalty contract, worked 1% harder because the loss of $80 RMB just feels bigger than the gain of 80 RMB, which their counterparts are experiencing. And this chart kind of explains why this happens. Now you may ask, why? Why do human beings resent losses so much and so consistently? Some scholars believe that this tendency in our behavior is actually the result of natural selection. Individuals who carry the genes that avoid risks tend to have a better chance of surviving in the wild because they don't expose themselves to as much danger as their risk-taking counterparts would do. So that kind of explains why loss aversion is so embedded in our behavior. All right, I'll pause here for the first half, and then I will come back and discuss other insights from behavioral economics in the second half.